The Cat King, Part 2. Today was a perfect summer day. What few clouds there were hung in a powder blue sky like giant pillows. Normally, the boys would gaze into the clouds and find dinosaurs, spaceships, and whatever else came to their imagination. But today was different. Despite the blue sky, Riley had a black cloud over his head. The boys rode around the neighborhood, hoping to find Patches lazily sleeping on someone's porch. Should we make posters? We can, I guess. I guess? Asked Riley resentfully. With hesitance in his voice, Jacob asked, Hasn't Patches done this before? There was silence amongst the boys, except for the clicking of the spokes on the 10 of hearts clipped to Riley's back wheel. The boys rode in silence until they reached Chestham Street, where they noticed a young Becca Schegel, a third grader, crying on her stoop. She wasn't just upset, but distraught. Tears ran down her chubby cheeks. Her face was beet red as she hyperventilated between sobs, trying to catch her breath. Riley has never seen anyone this upset. Without thinking, he approached her. "Are you okay?" She turned around to acknowledge him, but said nothing. She continued to cry. Riley could sense the pain radiating from her. He gently placed a hand on her back. He looked at Jacob, who looked back at him, and shrugged. Riley thought for a moment. How would Dad handle this? "Becca, is your mom home?" Riley thought that was a good question. His mom always made him feel better. Why wouldn't hers help her? "Cupcake is missing," she said between sobs, barely making out a coherent sentence. Riley looked at Jacob, who looked back at him with a glare that said, "We have a case." And just like that, Cutler and Backboard Detective Agency was founded. Riley and Jacob knew how to start an investigation. Winter nights filled with private lessons from Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John H. Watson have provided the boys with enough insight to, at the very least, question the witness. Jacob pulled out a little brown notebook from his back pocket. It had a light blue dinosaur on the cover, but since residing in his back pocket, the image has now become cracked and faded. Jacob opened the notebook, flipping the cover and the first few pages. Riley tried to read what it said, but it was indiscernible. Holding a bright orange No. 2 pencil in hand, Jacob asked in his most professional voice, "When was the victim last seen?" "Victim?" Becca said, with a confused tone. "When did you last see Cupcake?" Riley interjected. Jacob scoffed at the civilian speak. Becca looked up at the sky and said, This morning I was watching Powder Time." "Powder Time is such a girl's show." "Jacob!" Riley snapped. Jacob receded and began to chew on his No. 2 pencil. Becca continued, "Every morning he sits and waits for my milk. Mama didn't like it, but it's okay." "Then what happened?" Riley asked. Becca looked up as she thought. I finished my cereal, and he wasn't there to drink my milk, because he always drinks my milk, so I checked his bed, and he wasn't there, so I checked his litter box, and he wasn't there, so I looked under the covers. And let me guess, he wasn't there?" "Jacob!" Riley snapped. Jacob shut up, looking at Riley with embarrassment. Jacob meant nothing by it, but talking to a third grader could seriously come back to haunt him. Jacob looked around to make sure no one saw this conversation, then nervously returned to his wooden pacifier. "Has Cupcake ever escaped before?" Riley asked. A smile grew across his face. That was a good question, and he knew it. Suddenly, he felt like a real detective. Riley Holmes. Becca shook her head. "No, Cupcake was indoor." A voice called from inside the house. Becca turned around and said, "Coming, Mom." Then she turned back to Riley. "I miss Cupcake." He saw the pain in her swollen, tear-filled eyes. Pain he could relate all too much. "I promise. We'll find Cupcake." A little smile broke through the sadness as she met his words. She turned around and headed inside. Riley turned to Jacob and said, "Got all that?" Jacob looked at him, pencil in mouth, and said, "What?" It was noon, and the sun hung in the sky, illuminating all of Toronto in its golden rays. Riley and Jacob were hovering by a phone pole, reading a flyer that was loosely taped to the rotting wooden pole. Black fur, green eyes. Riley turned to Jacob, who was molar deep in his number 2. Getting all this? Jacob sprung to attention. Jacob looked down at his blank notepad. Yeah, almost done. He quickly scribbled a description, continuously looking up to ensure what he wrote was accurate. Says she was an indoor too. Riley turned to Jacob. I think this is bigger than we thought. Riley's attention was stolen by the sound of metal breaking against metal. The metal brakes let out a loud cry, followed by the sound of rubber tires skidding on the road. A tall boy with curly red hair walked over to Riley. Behind him were his 2 best friends, a chubby boy with a ripped Nirvana t-shirt probably given to him from his once cool dad, and next to him, a lanky boy with greasy, straight hair hiding eyes that said, I'll be a burnout in no time. The 3 boys dressed in camo pants with combat boots. The boy with the red hair did most of the talking, while his friends stood there and tried their best to impersonate someone who's tough. What are you faggots doing? Not now, Sean. Sean, the red-headed leader with no brake pads, turned to his friends. They watched him with anticipation. Sean pushed Riley. I ain't gonna take no shit from some little faggot. Jacob was a neurotic kid, and mostly avoided confrontation. Just leave, we're busy, Riley said. The boys in the back chuckled at the arrogance of speaking like that to someone twice your size. Fuck 'em up, man, the fat one retorted between labored breaths. Sean paid no mind to his friend. Instead, his eyes were locked on the poster. He looked down and said, This Miss Melanie's cat? Buster? Riley nodded. I used to babysit him when he was a kitten. Riley was surprised to see anything other than anger come from Sean, let alone dare Riley think it. Humanity? A voice from behind rang out. What's the little faggot saying? Sean whipped his head around. Will, shut the fuck up, all right? The boys were taken back. They leaned into each other and started mumbling. Sean paid no attention. There were more important things. What the fuck? Sean said under his breath as the realization hit him. Cat's missing? Riley asked with a bluntness that could only be acquired from years in the streets. Sean was taken back by the question. If you did anything to her, I will fucking gut. Sean was cut off. My cat's missing too. So was Becca's and Mrs. Swathorn's. Jacob, emerging from his number 2 induced haze, spoke up. We're currently investigating it. If you know anything. I don't know fuck, Sean snapped as he turned to his friends. Fuck you looking at? Both boys cowered and pretended to look busy. Sean turned back to the boys. No Merle the girl? Riley shrugged. Jacob spoke up. You mean the guy who wears the dirty wig? That's him. Sean turned around to see if his friends were eavesdropping. They were, but pretended not to listen. Sean turned back, trying to whisper. He owns a junkyard at the end of town. Rumors were that he stole children and used them for... Well, it doesn't matter. Point is, I wonder if he has something. Riley cut him off. Where is he? Jacob grabbed the drool-covered pencil and wrote an address. The saliva ran down the pencil and blotted the page. The boys began to head into the direction of the junkyard. Riley turned back to Sean and under his breath mouthed, Thank you. Sean cracked a subtle smile, then turned around. The fuck was that all about? Asked the greasy-haired friend. Mind your fucking business. The sun hung over a now cloudy sky as the boys made it to the edge of town. The heat rippled the asphalt, causing the illusion that the ground liquefied. The hot rays charred the boy's skin to a beet red, cooking their arms and face. Sweat pouring down his face, breathing heavily, Jacob asked, How big's this hill? Between labored breath, Riley just said, Just another block. Riley, a few feet ahead of Jacob, began to laugh. What? Jacob asked. It wasn't long before he began to drop his curiosity and laugh as well. As the ground leveled out to a steady surface, the boys laid their eyes on the biggest mountain of garbage they never imagined. Unfortunately for the boys, their noses caught up to their eyes. Without warning, the sweet and putrid smell of rotten produce and decaying meat attacked the senses in a symphony of stomach-churning triggers. Ugh, it smells like shit, Jacob said, covering his nose. Riley looked at Jacob, forgetting about the tragedy of the smell, thanks to the use of a word that he often thought, but rarely said. Getting in trouble for naughty words were the least of the problems for the boys. Half of the town was missing cats, and this mountain of forgotten knickknacks and Christmas gifts of days old could hold all the answers. And some cats. A large framed steel gate guarded the property in a giant square. Despite its gargantuan size, age has taken its best years, turning an otherwise sturdy fence into a rusted monolith of a time long before. A large red sign, mostly covered by a thick layer of grime and rust, hung loosely from a rusted nail sloppily hammered into a rotting piece of wood. The sign read, "Keep out. Watchdog on Gurod." "What's Gurod?" asked Riley. "I think that's what my grandmother would make for Rosh Hashanah," Jacob said. Riley didn't think that made sense, but continued on. "Let's follow the fence. I bet we can find a way in." The boys walked along the fence, looking for any tears or openings in which they could use as an opportunity to sneak in. "There!" Riley pointed. In a small corner where two fences met, there was a small gap, barely wide enough to fit. Riley tried first. The rusted metal clung to his t-shirt, spraying flakes of rust in the air and all over his face. Pfft! Riley blew the specks away from his face and mouth. The rust dust danced with the summer heat and dissipated into the wind. "I can't fit in there," Jacob said. "So wait here, I'll be quick." Jacob was taken back by this response. He looked both ways to ensure the coast was clear and slowly wedged himself between the poles. Like an invisible barrier, as soon as the boys made it to the other side, the smell became much stronger. Add in the summer heat, and you have yourself a rotting goulash with a stink strong enough to wake the dead. Mountains of mementos, lost to time, towered over the boys as flies darted between the skyscrapers of discarded Christmas cards, used tampons, rusted pans, and broken glass. Riley scouted his surroundings, looking for any sign of Patches, but it all looked, and smelled, the same. Piles of junk, once a treasured memory, now lost forever to become one with the giant crater floating in space. "Patches!" Riley shouted in a whisper. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked. Riley looked back in confusion, as if to say, "Don't you know why we're here?" Patches responds to his name. If he's here, he'll come. Suddenly, the boys heard something move. Atop a giant pile of rusted car parts and a small hunk of metal jiggled. The boys watched as the sheet of aluminum came to life, moving in sporadic, jerky motions. "That's Patches!" Riley made his way to the base of the rusted mountain and whispered, "Patches! Psst, psst!" The movement stopped. Jacob approached with hesitation as he watched Riley coax the thing behind the metal sheet. No movement. Whether it was a moment of impulsiveness, or he was overtaken by the spirit of spontaneity, it didn't matter. Without hesitation, Jacob grabbed a small black rock and whipped it at the metal sheet. Riley, stunned by the action, turned around, but before he could speak, he was startled. Without warning, a little body jumped from behind the metal sheet. Its body was fat with gray and black fur. Its face was pure horror, its eyes saucers that looked through you. The raccoon scurried down the mountain, passing the boys without thinking twice. Behind the pudgy raccoon was two smaller raccoons, with little stubby legs. Not as graceful as the mother, they stumbled down the mountain, occasionally bumping their little head while waddling all the same. The raccoons startled the boys so much, they didn't realize behind them stood a 90-pound Doberman, growling with not so much anger as excitement for fresh meat. Jacob looked at Riley. The look on his face, the fear in his eyes said one thing. "This is it."